Welcome to www.happynumbers.org, the educational research page. This lesson we're going to continue to talk about the quantitative research methodologies under the experimental and the single subject or single case designs. And this lesson's single case design is the changing criterion design. We've already talked about an AB withdrawal or reversal design, and we've already talked about a multiple baseline design. Today we're going to talk about a changing criterion design. So let's take a look at a changing criterion design. Here is the graph of a changing criterion design. So it's a very typical graph. Your x-axis, the horizontal axis, is a number of sessions, number of data collection sessions, and your y-axis is the number of behaviors. Okay, and you'll notice it looks like others. It has a baseline condition here, but the intervention is divided up into different phases, and I'm going to explain that as we go along, but I just wanted you to see the difference in so this is all the intervention. This is not the intervention and then back to baseline. But you see these lines are dotted, they're not solid lines, so they're talking about phases. Now these are all phases, and the intervention takes place during all of these. But let's take a look at it. Okay, changing criterion design is best used for evaluating the effects of an intervention or the independent variable or the treatment when applied in a stepwise manner. And that's why you have these phases. This is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, phase 5. So the intervention is being applied in a stepwise manner. The dependent variable, and this is very important for the changing criterion, the dependent variable must already be part of the subject's behavioral repertoire. In other words, the person has to already be able to perform this behavior. Therefore, the design is not good for teaching new skills. So this is not a design for teaching new skills. Actually, the quintessential thing this design would be like for quitting smoking, or let's say increasing eye contact or something like that. Something that can be done in a stepwise fashion. The changing criterion design consists of two conditions. Baseline condition, where there's continuous observation and measurement of the dependent variable. So let's say this graph represents a student on the autistic spectrum disorder who has inappropriate eye contact or inappropriate socialization skills or verbalization, something. So in baseline, the behavior is very low, and it's stabilized in terms of trend and level, and so we introduce an intervention. And that could be whatever. I keep saying positive reinforcement. But let's say it is positive reinforcement. So the baseline condition, that's one condition, and then the intervention condition with multiple phases. Each one of these is a phase. Now here's how the design works. A series of criterion levels are established. So the researcher says, okay, we have, it looks like about an average of 3 or 4 appropriate vocalizations. So we're going to intervene and we're going to set a criterion level in phase 1, and we want it to be about 15. And then we're going to, once it gets to be about 15, we're going to try and get it up to about 35 or something like that. And then we're trying to get it up to like about 40 or something like that. So the researcher establishes these criterion levels. The treatment is applied in the first phase, so it begins here, positive reinforcement, measurement of the dependent variable until stable at the rate of the initial criterion. So we set the initial criterion at this rate and it's stabilized, and then we continue on. We change the criterion again, and we continue with the intervention, and it is stabilized at that level. Then we change the criterion again, and it is stabilized. Now, sometimes in this design, the researcher will then set the criterion back down again to see if the behavior will come back down. If it does, it just strengthens the case for internal validity. However, it does really present some ethical issues as to why you would want behavior that is moving in a therapeutic direction to then reverse to a non-therapeutic direction. And then finally to the final criterion level. So basically how the design works, actually, pardon me, let's look at this graph. Let's talk about, let's make believe this was cigarette smoking. These numbers might change, but we have a person who's smoking cigarettes. And we're going to use some kind of an intervention, whatever that intervention is, to help them reduce. So you can see that it would make a lot of sense that they would cut down. Let's suppose they were smoking 20 cigarettes a day, then they cut down to 15, then down to 10, and so on and so on. That would indicate that the intervention is working. And then we could say with a fairly high degree of probability that it was the intervention that has caused the data to move in a therapeutic direction. So that is the procedure for a change in criterion design. Again, it has a baseline, just like the other designs, but it has phases, and there are criterions levels set for each phase. And by the way, you'll notice that each phase is not the same length, and that's used to increase the internal validity also, so that it's not just the length of the phases. So experimental control, the changing criterion design allows for the analysis of the effect of the treatment, the independent variable, through the progressive application of changes in the performance required on the dependent variable. Internal validity is established when changes in the subject's level of performance, the different levels in the phases, consistently correspond at or near the stepwise changes in the required criterion. In other words, the researcher at the beginning of the study has set the criterion levels for each of these phases. If the behavior moves and settles around those criterion levels, then the researcher can say with a pretty good degree of certainty that there is a functional relation between the independent variable of the treatment and the dependent variable. Internal validity is demonstrated when there are immediate and abrupt changes in the dependent variable between phases, the subject's performance level coincides with the criterion level, and stability is achieved at each graduated manipulation of the criterion. I have this cold that's killing me. Advantages, simple way to establish functional relation. Positive, the independent variable is always applied throughout the investigation. Other than baseline, the subject or subjects are in an intervention condition. It's appropriate for evaluating gradual changes in behavior. It limits certain threats to internal validity, and it ends on an intervention, which means it leaves the person generally in a positive setup. Limitations. It's limited to a dependent variable that already is in the subject's behavioral repertoire. So the person has to be able to do the behavior. Otherwise, it will not work. And it's limited to dependent variables that can be gradually modified. There are some ethical considerations about extended period of time because of the different phases. So it takes a certain amount of time to get all the way up to the final criterion level. And another thing, it requires the researcher or the investigator to subjectively define criterion levels. Like, how do you define, if let's say in the quitting smoking example, how do you define what would be an appropriate first phase and second phase and so on? That's sort of scratching your head and guesswork. And this design has limited external validity. It doesn't generalize well. Again, you would need multiple replications. Well, that is the changing criterion design. Here's just another example of what it looks like. Thank you very much. See you next time.